In January 1978, psychotherapist Phyllis Atwater was working in a hospital when she suddenly felt a sharp, unbearable pain running through her body and almost paralyzing her movements. Despite her terrible condition, she managed to open the door to her office a little and call for help. But strangely, no one responded to her cries. The pain increased to the point where she had to scream with all her strength, but even that didn't bring any relief. No one came to help. At one point, barely aware of what was happening, Phyllis screamed as loudly as she could, but soon fell silent. She had seen something so horrible that she was at a loss for words. Her own lifeless body lay on the floor in front of her, and at that moment she could not decide whether she was more frightened by death itself or by the fact that she was watching it from the outside. It was her first experience of clinical death. Not everyone has to go through the state of clinical death, and not everyone who does manages to retain the memory of their out-of-body experience. This can explain why some people who have experienced clinical death talk about amazing out-of-body experiences, while others say they saw nothing. This is the conclusion of Phyllis Marie Atwater, a psychotherapist and one of the first NDE researchers. For most people this would be a shocking experience, but Phyllis has had 3 in a row, meaning she has died 3 times and come back from the other side 3 times. She describes it this way: "I have had 3 clinical deaths and I can say with certainty that what I saw was not a figment of my imagination or a side effect of medication. It's hard to believe that I could have seen the same thing 3 times. It doesn't work that way." After returning from the other side of the world, Phyllis decided to share her experience without fear of judgment or ridicule, even from her colleagues who might have thought she was crazy. As a result, she not only revealed the secrets of out-of-body experiences to the world, but also became a renowned researcher in the field. The first time Phyllis found herself out of body, she was able to calm down because she was a doctor and knew how to deal with such situations. But every time she tried to return to her body, she felt she was facing something insurmountable. Black blobs of ink began to appear around her, and this added to her fear. But each time she came back, the sensation was like being stretched like a rubber band and then released. After the first experience, she thought it was over, but a month later she experienced clinical death again. This time, she found herself in a void and saw her whole life, including the consequences of her thoughts. It was an amazing and enlightening experience that changed her perception of life and death. 7 months later, Phyllis Atwater experienced another clinical death. According to her, on all 3 occasions she did not meet anyone who had died. In each of her near-death experiences, Phyllis was alone. Unlike the previous times, this time she heard a voice. It was so loud that Phyllis felt the whole universe was speaking to her. This voice said, "You are to tell the whole world about your experiences, do research, and write 3 books, one of which will be called Memories of the Future." This was said to me just before I was to be appointed as a bank manager. You know, in those days it was very rare for women to become bank managers, so the position was very dear to me. But now I realized that I had a more important mission. I decided to quit my job. On Monday morning I went to my boss's office. I told him why I was leaving. My boss turned pale and gave me a stunned look as he walked me to the door. My children were now on their own, so I was able to sell my house, which I could no longer afford to keep. I began my new journey by telling my story to an audience. Later, Phyllis began her research. She spoke to many clinical near-death survivors and wrote her first book about children's near-death experiences because she found their stories the most interesting. Children rarely talk about their experiences of clinical death. This is because what they see seems normal to them. Children think it happens to everybody. Some of them decide to talk about their near-death experiences when they are older. It's only when they grow up that they realize they've experienced something unusual, something that may even have changed their lives, explains Phyllis Atwater. For example, a 5-year-old boy called Tom told his father about a park he went to through a big tube when he was in hospital. In this park, there were lots of children on swings. There was a white fence. He wanted to climb over it, but a man told him he couldn't. He sent him back down the chimney and he ended up back in hospital. Another boy, who experienced clinical death at the age of 1, asked his parents 3 years later if his deceased grandmother would pass through the same garden as him when she went to meet God. According to Phyllis Atwater, most children talk about their near-death experiences when they grow up. That's what happened to Natalia. She was 33 years old when she told Phyllis what happened to her when she was 9 years old. Natalia was born deaf. When she was 9, she had a bad case of whooping cough. The girl was at home, fast asleep, when she was awakened by a bright light. The light came in through the edge of the door, and I could hear my name being called, recalls Natalia. She got up to see what the light was and turned around to find herself asleep in bed. The voice kept calling Natalia's name, so she opened the door to the room and saw a clear, bright light. Then someone put a hand on her shoulder and told her to go back. Natalia had not told anyone about her experience for many years. I thought they would call me a liar or crazy, she says. Phyllis Atwater observed that many survivors of death are surprised to find that life goes on. They can see, hear, and feel, even though their physical bodies no longer function. In one of her books, she compared life after death to a radio wave. We can switch to a different frequency, but that doesn't mean the previous frequency disappears. This knowledge of the afterlife changes people. They become kinder and stop chasing material pleasures, realizing that their future life will be connected to a completely different reality.